Gastronomic Realism, A Cautionary Tale, by Don Loeb. Published in the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, Volume 23, Number 1, Spring 2003. Daniel Robinson's Praise and Blame offers a vigorous and ambitious new defense of moral realism, a position sometimes characterized as the view that there are moral facts that are independent of our beliefs about them. As Robinson's discussion shows, the debate over moral realism has a long and complicated history. Much less has been said, however, about realism concerning other sorts of value. Perhaps one of the least initially appealing of these involves a commitment to the objective goodness and badness of various foods and beverages. Such a view, which we can call gastronomic realism, holds that there are facts about gastronomic value, facts of which are similarly independent of our beliefs. On the face of it, such a position seems highly implausible, even silly. De gustibus non disputandum est, and one man's meat is another's poison, are adages we have all heard many times, and these seem to suggest that there are no facts about how good or bad particular foods and drinks are. But surprisingly, many of the arguments that have been used to defend moral realism seem equally well suited for the defense of gastronomic realism. A good deal of this paper is devoted to making out the case for such a parity of treatment. Now, as a moral irrealist, I find it very tempting to use the parallels between the two forms of realism as the basis for a reductio ad absurdum of moral realism. If gastronomic realism, though highly implausible, is just as defensible as moral realism, then perhaps we ought to reject moral realism along with it. Arguments that can be used to defend such an apparently ridiculous position, we might think, can't be very good ones after all. In the end, however, I am not sure whether the parallels actually do support such a reductio. In fairness, I might have to admit that gastronomic realism has more going for it than meets the eye. Instead of trying to decide which of these routes to take, however, I'll offer a suggestion of quite a different sort about what we might learn from the comparison. I'll argue that gastronomic and moral realism share an important but often neglected feature with their counterparts, gastronomic and moral irrealism. In both cases, the most plausible approaches leave room for the possibility that value facts of the sort defended can sensibly be ignored in a person's decision-making in favor of a course of action grounded in her own personal concerns and commitments. Bringing this common feature into focus, I will argue, can help to make moral irrealism a more palatable alternative to moral realism than has often been thought. But first, I shall try to be a little clearer about what gastronomic realism is. Section 1. What is gastronomic realism? We've all had the thought that some foods and drinks are simply better than others. Yet too little has been said by philosophers about the metaphysical status of these claims. Moral realists like Robinson have helped us to see the plausibility of the claim that evaluative facts are possible within the moral realm. In so doing, they have opened the door to parallel claims about other sorts of evaluative realisms, and perhaps to gastronomic realism in particular. But what exactly is gastronomic realism? At a minimum, it is the view that gastronomic value properties, or GVPs, such as the property of being an excellent Valpolicella Classico or being an inferior Vigisoise, are real. Precisely what it means to claim that GVPs are real is a question that needn't trouble us here. Gastronomic realism, like its counterpart moral realism, is compatible with any number of plausible answers. Our rough characterization of it as the view that there are facts about gastronomic value that are independent of our beliefs about them should be precise enough for present purposes. To get GVPs sharply into focus, however, it is necessary to distinguish them from other, less controversial properties in the neighborhood. No one doubts that there are any number of non-evaluative facts about how foods taste. For example, that maple candy tastes sweeter to the average person than horseradish. Similarly, it is uncontroversial that certain foods taste better or worse to certain individuals. It is a perfectly ordinary psychological fact that I don't like the taste of green peppers, for example. Likewise, there are perfectly ordinary social facts about these matters of taste, facts about broad patterns of intersubjective responses to certain types of foods. Presumably, for example, everyone likes ice cream is a fairly accurate generalization. The question is not whether facts like these exist, for surely they do. We must also put aside moral questions surrounding food. Some people think that it is morally preferable to eat plants rather than animals. But even if this thesis were correct, that would not make a veggie burger better than a filet de bœuf en croûte, at least not in the sense that I have in mind here. Similarly, when I ask whether some foods are good or better than others, I do not have in mind the question of which foods are the most healthful, inexpensive, readily available, or beneficial to us in some other way. Even if tofu was better for us than gratin dauphinois, that doesn't make it gastronomically better. The question I'm addressing here is whether some foods are actually better than others. Not better for our health, better. As I suggested above, gastronomic realism, so understood, is likely to sound implausible to many of us. But for now I want to put its ultimate plausibility aside, and ask whether it is as similar to moral realism as I have been hinting. In the next 4 sections, I consider several of the arguments that have been used to defend moral realism, and argue that this is indeed the case. Section 2. A presumption in favor of gastronomic realism? What can be said in gastronomic realism's defense? Moral realists often argue that moral realism should be our metaethical starting point, the default view unless decisive objections to it are found. Gastronomic realists may wish to avail themselves of a presumption of just this sort. In the spirit of their moral realist counterparts, they may ask why gastronomic realism needs a defense. To see whether it would be reasonable to privilege gastronomic realism in this way, we need to look at the moral case first, and ask what it is that makes so many moral realists think it is reasonable to presume that their favored theory is correct. Moral realists often begin by pointing to the nature of our moral experience, very broadly construed. Morality does not feel as though it is simply a projection from our own minds. It does not seem as though we are observing a value-bereft world and then overlaying it with some sort of subjective moral response. On the contrary, the world we observe seems to be full of moral value and disvalue. We feel the demands of morality pressing upon us, as if from the outside, and not as expressions of our own attitudes and feelings. We wonder what it requires, rather than what we will happen to emote next. We speak of it in the declarative mood, as if we mean to be making statements of moral fact. We think that we might be mistaken about moral questions, and that we and everyone else have been mistaken in the past. These and other features of our moral experience are brought together in support of the claim that this experience has an air of objectivity to it, and this is what is thought to raise a presumption in moral realism's favor. But gastronomic experience proves surprisingly similar. For example, some foods clearly seem to be better than others. It is not as though we experience the taste of food non-evaluatively, and then overlay this raw experience with qualitative judgments reflecting our own gastronomic values. We sometimes wonder whether we have picked the best entree and not just whether we will like it. We experience the pad thai as good or bad. When we speak of these matters of gastronomic value, we do so in the declarative mood, as though we mean to be stating facts about them. For example, we often say things like, El Alpolina's chimichangas are the worst I've ever eaten, or the snails were magnificent today. In the absence of compelling considerations to the contrary, shouldn't we take our gastronomic experience at face value, as moral realists tell us we should with our moral experience? Admittedly, the character of our gastronomic experience is not wholly and unvaryingly objective, but the character of our moral experience is not wholly and unvaryingly objective either. For example, as anyone who has taught ethics can tell you, many people when asked about morality say things like, it's all relative, or I only know what's right for me. Conversely, it's easy to underestimate people's willingness to acknowledge the possibility of error in the gastronomic realm. In fact, claims about erroneous gastronomic judgments are rather commonplace. It would not be at all odd for me to say that only a Philistine would fail to recognize the superiority of Vermont Grade A fancy maple syrup to Log Cabin Light, or that it is foolish to think that a chop suey is anywhere near as good as Beijing duck. But even if it were fair to say that on balance our experience of value in both the moral and the gastronomic context presents it as a matter of objective fact, we would still need to ask why that experience is supposed to support a presumption in favor of these sorts of value realism. Why is it an advantage for a theory to map onto everyday experience? Perhaps insofar as that experience reflects widespread belief in moral or gastronomic facts, or in propositions whose truth depends on the existence of these facts, the value realist is claiming that conservation of these everyday beliefs, or their implications, is an important desideratum of theory acceptance. Or perhaps the value realist thinks that the best explanation for our experiencing the world of value as a realm of objective fact requires the assumption that there are such facts. But both of these claims are controversial, and would need to be defended if we were to take our experience seriously as supporting a presumption in favor of value realism. Still, there seems to be little reason for taking the objective-seeming character of moral experience as better evidence for moral realism than there is for taking the objective-seeming character of gastronomic experience as evidence for gastronomic realism. Unfortunately for value realists of both stripes, however, serious objections to moral realism have indeed been raised, and these might as easily be directed at gastronomic realism. Against the claim that the world of value seems to be a world of objective fact is the very widespread disagreement about matters of gastronomic and moral value. Although I cannot develop the argument from disagreement in great depth here, I can show how much of what has been said for and against moral realism on the basis of moral disagreement could be mirrored in a debate over gastronomic realism. I turn to that task next. Section 3. The Argument from Disagreement. The argument from disagreement is perhaps the most prominent objection that has been raised against moral realism. If moral properties are real and we are somehow able to apprehend them, it is argued, then why is there so much disagreement? Some of it apparently intractable about their nature. The best explanation for the diversity of moral practices and opinions, the argument continues, is that we pick up our values from our cultures, and not from actual awareness of any moral facts. But if so, why should we believe in the existence of moral facts at all? A similar argument can be directed at GVPs. Disagreement about which foods are good are notoriously common. My son insists that caviar is awful. I find it exquisite. In an effort to demonstrate the correctness of my view, I have shown him several articles in Gourmet magazine. But he stubbornly refuses to acknowledge that my claims about caviar's high gastronomic value are correct. Would situations like this be so common if gastronomic realism were true? Previous generations of gastronomic realists might have been troubled by questions of this sort, but, armed with the latest philosophical tools of the moral realist, the contemporary gastronomic realist can attempt to allay doubts stemming from disagreements over gastronomic value. In the moral case, first of all, we do not need to explain away all disagreement. That would be too much to ask in any dispute. Some questions are difficult, and we need not be overly optimistic about their ultimate resolution. Furthermore, we should not expect for there to be determinate answers to all moral questions. And when there are no such answers, it is not surprising that disagreements persist. Some cases can be expected to involve borderline indeterminacy of a sort no less likely to be present in non-moral contexts, contexts in which we wouldn't think this a cause for abandoning realism with respect to the vast majority of cases. There may be no answer to the question of whether a stool is a chair or a teepee a house, for example, and this may give rise to disagreements about how to characterize particular objects, but that doesn't, and shouldn't, worry realists about chairs and houses. Other times there will be irresolvable conflicts among incommensurable but real moral values. Perhaps there is no metric for comparing the importance of preserving a forest with that of preserving a number of jobs in the timber industry, for instance. Or there may be cases in which two equally good answers to a moral question are available. It may be just as good to send your charitable donation to Oxfam as it is to send it to UNICEF. In such cases, too, partisans on one side or the other may fail to grasp the strength of the competing position, and thus may wind up sticking to their guns in these moral disputes. But even if disagreement in these sorts of cases persists, this disagreement does not threaten the claim that moral facts exist. Disagreements of these sorts should not trouble the gastronomic realists any more than they do the moral realist. For example, there may be no precise point after which one has put too much or too little anchovy paste in a Caesar salad, but that fact alone gives us no reason to reject the common sense view that there are clear cases at either end of the spectrum. Similarly, the gastronomic virtues inherent in cheese doodles may be of an entirely different sort than those of double-stuffed Oreos, making comparative evaluation impossible in principle, even though enthusiasts in each camp still think themselves possessed of the greater wisdom. In the fun core and the shumai may be equally good choices at the dim sum restaurant, leading to disagreements over which is the better choice. But the existence of disagreement in any of these sorts should be no more troubling to a gastronomic realist than it is to a moral one. Of course, there still appears to be a lot of gastronomic disagreement of the more troubling kind, cases in which we really should expect resolution if GVPs are real and we have reasonably good epistemic access to them. But a good deal of this, like a good deal of the residual moral disagreement, can be explained as owing to simple ignorance of ordinary, non-evaluative facts. Surely gastronomic irrealists can take nothing from the fact that a child who refuses to taste tripe thinks macaroni and cheese better. Until she has tasted tripe, she is really in no position to make a comparative judgment. Similarly, as moral realists often remind us, the ability to appreciate things of value, such as other people's rights and interests, may require a certain sophistication, developed over a long period of time, and we can expect disagreements among the less sophisticated, or between the more and the less sophisticated. But this sort of disagreement does not threaten realism about GVPs either. Another argument that has been put forward by defenders of moral realism is that one's moral judgment can be distorted by too much of a focus on irrelevant non-moral facts, such as the fact that a given action will harm oneself rather than another, and that this is a source of much moral disagreement. Similarly, one's gastronomic judgment can be impaired by too much attention to facts irrelevant to questions of gastronomic value. My son, for example, thought haggis excellent until I revealed its provenance to him. Now he thinks it awful. But surely he was in a better position to appreciate its goodness before learning those irrelevant but attention-grabbing facts. We have not yet exhausted the moral realist's store of tools for explaining why apparent moral disagreement does not threaten moral realism. And those tools that remain might also help the gastronomic realist in responding to the haggis case and others like it. For example, it is now widely recognized that there is no such thing as a pure observation, one that is not influenced by antecedently held theory. Thus, if my son thinks certain parts of the sheep are gross, that is likely to have a significant effect on his actual experience of haggis. It may seem bad to him, that is, not because it is bad, but because he, in some sense, expects it to be bad. Yet people in Scotland who hold different background beliefs are likely to think it just bonny. On a related note, the social nature of learning makes it likely that people from different cultures will have different gastronomic values, at least in the short run. Even scientific knowledge does not typically come in a flash of personal insight, and most such knowledge does not come from our own observations either. Instead, we rely on a vast array of intellectual forebearers, such as teachers and textbook authors, and differences in training may account for differences in perspective. It would be surprising if the way we learn about morality failed to mirror the way that we learn about science. Thus, the hypothesis that initially seemed to support the argument of disagreement, that we pick up our moral values from our culture, far from being at odds with moral realism, is actually quite compatible with it. It should be no more surprising that people coming from different moral traditions sometimes have different views on moral questions than is the parallel fact about people from differing scientific or pre-scientific traditions. Similarly, in the gastronomic context, it should come as no surprise if people from Thailand typically think Thai food better than Vietnamese. Their judgments are no less likely to be tied to cultural tradition than those we make in scientific and moral contexts. But the fact that our beliefs depend to some degree on cultural variables in no way counts against realism about the underlying subject matter. Another tool comes from relatively recent advances in epistemology. During the first half of the 20th century, ethics appeared to be saddled with a foundationalist epistemology, typified by certain intuitionists' claim that a small number of highly general moral principles can be apprehended directly, with the rest derived inferentially from these together with certain non-moral premises. The result, according to one contemporary realist, was that it seemed impossible to reason with one another about moral questions unless there was antecedent agreement about those foundational principles. But we needn't accept this old-fashioned view of moral justification. Instead, we can adopt an approach according to which more specific moral judgments and principles can also be used to undermine or support more general ones, in a give and take Rawls called the method of reflective equilibrium. And once again, the same moves are available to the gastronomic realist. No longer must I throw up my hands when told by my son that fish is awful, forced to hide behind the unsatisfying thought that the boy just doesn't see the goodness. I can reason with him by pointing out that salmon, sturgeon, and pike are good, in the hopes that in this way I can change his mind about the more general question. Finally, just as it is important to avoid exaggerating the amount of moral disagreement that exists by overlooking the very extensive agreement that we find on moral questions, it is important to avoid exaggerating the amount of gastronomic disagreement that exists by overlooking the very extensive agreement that we find on gastronomic questions. Almost everyone thinks that fruits, sweets, and pasta are good, for example, and no one thinks this of sand, sulfur, or cow manure. Of course, in neither the gastronomic nor the moral realm has anyone made any serious effort to canvass the disagreement we do find, with an eye to seeing whether it can be explained away in the ways discussed here. Here I think Robinson is quite right in emphasizing the importance of empirical research for this area of inquiry. Until we know more, we can expect conflict among philosophers about whether disagreement is a significant problem for either sort of realism, and for that matter, whether agreement is a problem for irrealism. Still, if a presumption in favor of a particular form of realism is warranted, then the unresolved status of the argument from disagreement means that it cannot be used to dislodge our commitment to that form of realism. Irrealists will have to turn to other arguments if they wish to defeat it. One of these, the argument from explanation, is the subject of the next section. Section 4. The argument from explanation. Gilbert Harman's book, The Nature of Morality, contains an argument that has had a profound influence on metaethical thinking since its publication in 1977. The argument stems from the view, very roughly, that it is sensible to believe in the existence of a kind of entity or property, if and only if we can fit that entity or property into the best available explanatory schema. The challenge to moral realists, then, is to show us how moral facts can explain, and why we should believe that they do. If there is no place for moral facts in our best global explanatory picture, Harman's argument suggests, we would have no good reason to believe in them, and hence no reason to treat our moral intuitions as having any evidentiary force. Several moral realists have taken up this challenge, arguing sometimes that moral facts could be fit into such an explanatory schema, and sometimes even that moral facts do figure in the best explanations we can come up with. For an example of the former, Nicholas Sturgeon tells us that the bad character of a certain past midshipman Salim Woodworth, one of the people who was expected to help rescue the Donner Party, could explain why so little was done actually to help them. Midshipman Woodworth acted as he did, Sturgeon suggests, because he was just no damned good. Now, it is true that we might have explained these facts in ways that do not appeal to moral facts of the sort hypothesized by Sturgeon. For example, we might explain Midshipman Woodworth's inaction on the grounds that he cared more about himself than he cared about others, that he was lazy, and that he was a thief. But the mere existence of such non-evaluative explanations should not sour us on equally good evaluative explanations. Non-moral explanations, says Sturgeon, do not always compete with moral ones, and as often corroborate as undermine them. Speaking loosely, we can say that Midshipman Woodworth's badness supervened on these ordinary psychological traits, and thus that his badness is compatible with both their existence and their explanatory power. Can GVPs explain? Of course they can, argues the gastronomic realist. Why do people pay such high prices to eat at La Tour d'Argent? Because the food is so good there. Why hasn't Ben & Jerry's come out with ketchup and onion flavored ice cream? Because that would be an awful flavor. Why does Indian food seem better than English food? Because it is better than English food. Much better. We appeal to explanations of this sort all the time. If the availability of explanatory claims like these is enough to validate moral realism, then we would seem to have equally good evidence for gastronomic realism. Once again, the realist may try to point to alternative explanations for the phenomena in question, explanations making no mention of GVPs. For example, she might point out that we could explain the business decision at Ben & Jerry's by reference to the ordinary non-evaluative fact that people wouldn't like ketchup and onion-flavored ice cream, even if they could be persuaded to try it. But if non-moral explanations need not compete with moral ones, then similarly the existence of explanations not involving GVPs should not rule out explanations involving such properties. Of course people wouldn't like that flavor, we can say, following Sturgeon. That's because it would be awful. Really awful. Now, showing that explanations of these sorts are possible is not the same thing as showing that they support realism. It is not easy to establish that properties of either sort really do figure in the best global explanatory picture we can come up with. If, however, a presumption in favor of realism, in either realm, were warranted for the reasons sketched above, then the realist wouldn't need to claim that they do. A merely possible role in explanation undermines any attempt to argue that explanations of that sort are impossible, as Harman seemed to argue they are. One might hold out hope for something more here, some positive reason for thinking that facts of a particular sort really do figure in the best explanatory theory we can come up with. But given the notorious difficulty involved in undertaking such a showing, realists have often been content merely to give suggestive examples and rely on the presumption, rather than actually to defend the explanatory claims fully. Gastronomic realists should be entitled to nothing less. Section 5. The Argument from Queerness. As we have seen, realists have sometimes responded to the argument from explanation by claiming that moral facts can earn a place no different from that claimed by scientific facts in our best global explanatory theory. Attempts to demystify moral properties in this way might also help realists to respond to the so-called argument from queerness, another of the central objections to moral realism. Unfortunately, the queerness objection has never been entirely clear, in part because J.L. Mackie, who gave it the name, seemed to have several different, if loosely related, things in mind by it. Thus we can isolate a number of different complaints against moral realism that have sometimes been treated as falling under this heading. And once again, these complaints have natural counterparts in the debate over gastronomic realism. Mackie thought that if there were moral properties, they would have to be very odd sorts of entities, and that we would need a correspondingly odd means of epistemic access to them. Non-natural moral properties in an intuitionistic moral epistemology seem to him perfect examples of the metaphysical and epistemological lengths people would have to go to in order to defend moral realism. There are other important dimensions to the queerness objection as well. One respect in which moral properties would be odd is that they would apparently have to combine two elements, the combination of which seemed hard to fathom. Mackey called these elements objectivity and prescriptivity. Conceptual analysis, he claimed, reveals that moral statements would have to both describe the world and at the same time authoritatively tell us what to do, and thus that for moral realism to be correct, there would have to be properties corresponding to these complex and ambitious statements. Moreover, the properties themselves would somehow have to supervene on ordinary natural properties, such as the property of being a violent attack on a child. And once again, we'd face an enormous epistemic demand. Awareness of not only the supervening moral properties, but also the natural properties on which they depend, as well as the mysterious consequential link between the two. Finally, moral properties would have to be the sort of things awareness of which brought with it overriding motivation to comply, not in virtue of the peculiarities of anyone's individual psychology, but because the moral goals themselves have to be pursuedness somehow built into them. In this section, I consider what I take to be the three most important strands of argument from queerness, and consider their applicability to the case of gastronomic value. A. Non-naturalism and metaphysical queerness. One aspect of Mackey's queerness objection rested on his assumption that moral properties would have to be sui generis, belonging in a special ontological category, all their own, the non-natural. This claim raised a number of worries, perhaps the most significant of which was the apparent conflict with the widespread commitment to ontological parsimony, the thesis, closely related to Occam's razor, that we would do well to avoid committing ourselves to the existence of additional ontological categories if we can reasonably do without them. In response, many contemporary moral realists have simply denied that moral properties must be non-natural. Moral properties, according to a widely held view, are natural properties just like any others. Typically, it is added that these properties supervene on other natural properties, in something like the way the property of being a table supervenes on the property of being a certain kind of collection of molecules. Gastronomic realists can take a similar position. Gastronomic properties are natural properties that supervene on other natural properties, such as the property of being salty, crunchy, bitter, or sweet, and these in turn supervene on various microphysical properties. Thus, no special metaphysical problem arises for gastronomic realism, and no issue of ontological parsimony arises either. B. Epistemic queerness. Another worry Mackey expressed was epistemological. How can we come to know particular moral facts, and hence have a basis on which to conclude the moral facts in general exist? This problem seems particularly acute for non-naturalists. If moral properties are sui generis, occupying their own ontological realm, how is it that we are able to gain awareness of them? Mackey thought that the best answer a realist could give here would be to fall back on a mysterious faculty of intuition, through which we are able to directly apprehend at least some fundamental moral truths. But that, Mackey thought, would be a very odd sort of faculty indeed. Moreover, it is not clear how the wrongness of an act could cause us to judge that the act is wrong. No conceivable mechanism can plausibly explain the link between the wrongness and our judgment of wrongness in a given case, he seemed to think. Similar arguments could as well be directed against gastronomic realism. We can tell a fairly straightforward story about how our taste buds and other sense organs are involved in our coming to recognize that certain food tastes as they do, but what organs are employed in discerning the gastronomic value that inheres more in some foods than in others? As Mackey said, a special sort of intuition is a lame answer, but it is the one to which the clear-headed objectivist is compelled to resort. There seems to be no conceivable mechanism for our coming to recognize true the gastronomic value of foods. Contemporary moral realists deny that they are committed to such an odd epistemology, however. Since moral properties are natural properties, we have no reason to worry about the possibility of epistemic access to some apparently remote ontological realm. We can observe moral facts in much the same way that we can observe anything else, relying on a combination of empirical input and background theory. My ability to recognize that an axe-murderer is evil is no more difficult to explain than my ability to recognize that he is a Shriner. Even without some mysterious Shriner detecting faculty, I am able, given my background knowledge about how Shriners behave, the sorts of hats they wear, the little cars they drive, etc., to see him for what he is. In either context, of course, my beliefs could turn out to be false, but the risk of error presents no special problem for the claim that these sorts of knowledge are possible. Similarly, The gastronomic realists can claim that GVPs, being natural properties, knowledge of them and of gastronomic value more generally seems unproblematic. There is no more reason to think that we'd need some sort of gastronomic value sensor to detect them than there is to think we need a similar sensor for detecting moral value. Informed by suitable background theory, one can easily tell a good hot dog from a bad one. More easily, in fact, than one can tell a good person from a bad one. C. Normativity. Perhaps most importantly, Mackey argued that moral properties would have to be the sorts of things knowledge of which produced in the knower an overriding motivation to act in accordance with their demands. A motivation not in any way contingent upon the psychology of the knower. The claims about properties having this sort of magnetic power are highly implausible, and indeed, the idea that recognition of anything could somehow short circuit the operation of the laws of psychology has little to recommend it. Given its commitment to the existence of such properties, Mackey thought, moral realism is implausible. And if GVPs would have to be similar in motivational impact to moral properties, then we had best avoid crediting them as real too. Once again, however, contemporary moral realists reject the claim that they are committed to entities of the sort Mackey imagines them committed to. Many alternatives are available. That moral facts motivate upon recognition, but that they do not necessarily motivate overridingly. That moral facts needn't motivate on recognition, but do provide us with reasons, overriding or merely pro tanto, for action. More boldly, some moral realists deny that there must be any non-contingent connection between our moral beliefs and our motivations, or between the moral facts and our reasons for action. It is enough, says the realist, that recognition of moral facts typically motivates and that we often have reasons to do what morality requires. And that sort of connection is easy enough to find. Most of us want to be good or want things like friends that being good can help us to get. Gastronomic realists face a similar array of possibilities. They can deny that GVPs overridingly motivate upon recognition and that there is any necessary connection between a food's having high gastronomic value and what's having overriding reasons to eat it. Or they can deny that there is any necessary connection between gastronomic value and reasons or motives for eating. So long as strong contingent connections among these things are present, the gastronomic realist can argue, we can still reasonably claim that there is real gastronomic value. And here again, the connection is not hard to see. People typically do want to eat good foods rather than bad ones. Section 6. Lessons for moral realists? It might still be possible to find some relevant and important difference between moral and gastronomic realism. But if I am right in thinking the case for realism about GVPs to be about as strong as the case for realism about moral properties such as goodness and rightness, then we are left with only two possibilities. We can accept that there is reason to treat both sorts of properties as real, or reject them both, perhaps treating the parallels between gastronomic and moral realism as the basis for a reductio ad absurdum of the latter. I confess that when I began this project I was more tempted by the possibility of such a reductio than I am now. On more careful reflection, I think it wiser to withhold judgment on that question. But what is at stake when we ask whether to accept or reject one of these forms of realism anyway? Perhaps one lesson we can draw from this exercise is that it matters less than we might have thought. To show this, I will suppose for the moment that gastronomic realism is correct, that some foods really are better than others, and further that we have gotten to be pretty good at identifying GVPs when we see, or taste, them. How might I reasonably react to a realization that this is all true? I might try reforming my diet. Health, moral, and economic concerns being equal, I might begin choosing the better over the worse whenever possible. And no doubt some aspects of my newly modified diet would meet with my immediate approval. I'd enjoy some of the things I had been reluctant to try, for instance, and I'd probably enjoy good food more than I would bad or mediocre food for the most part. Given time and continued exposure, I might even come to take pleasure in good foods I had previously found distasteful. With food, familiarity can sometimes breed enjoyment. But somewhere down the line, I might well run across foods that, although really quite good, taste awful to me, no matter what I do to try to enjoy them. Does anyone think that it would be reasonable for me to continue choosing these foods over worse but more enjoyable alternatives? I suppose it's possible that I might have a strong preference for eating the good over the bad, such that the bad experience would be thought of but a small price to pay to secure something that I care a good deal more about. Although conceivable, However, this would certainly be an odd sort of preference, and not one that most people would ever find themselves possessed of. When it comes to which foods to consume, I have to make my decision on the basis of my own gastronomic values. That foods actually have gastronomic value is relevant to me only if I value eating what has it. There is nothing irrational about not caring a whit about what is really good and eschewing it in favor of what one enjoys. Indeed, it is hard to imagine a person taking any other course of action seriously. Of course, if there really are GVPs, then there may also be gastronomic oughts. Perhaps I ought to eat what is good. But oughts of this kind are of no more interest to me than oughts governing which fork I eat the food with. There is nothing narrow-minded, crazy, or even mistaken about ignoring them. If gastronomic realism is correct, then it would of course be possible to make mistakes about which foods are good or about how good they are. But it is hard to see how a suitably informed person could be mistaken in preferring worse foods to better ones. That decision is still up to us, and not just in the political sense that we are free to make it for ourselves, but in the evaluative sense that such decisions are not ordinarily subject to rational criticism. We can call a decision whether or not to let one's conduct be governed by any particular sort of ought fundamental. When a fundamental decision must be made, the value system itself may tell you what to choose, but the fact that it does so is of no use in deliberations about whether or not to subscribe to that system in the first place. That there is more gastronomic value in good foods than in bad ones tells nothing about whether to choose those foods. Then how are we to make fundamental decisions? We have no real choice but to make them from the standpoint of what we value now. Even if there are facts about what has gastronomic value, that is, one still must make a fundamental decision about whether to arrange one's conduct in accordance with such value. The interesting thing is that the same is true in regards to moral value. Supposing for the moment that there are real moral oughts, one must still decide whether or not to govern one's conduct in accordance with them. No doubt it would be immoral not to. We ought subscript M to do what morality requires. But there are likely to be conflicts between the oughts of morality and the oughts of prudence, law, or instrumental rationality, to name a few. Thus the fact that we ought subscript M to behave in a certain way tells us nothing about whether we ought, all things considered, to do so. I realize that my behavior makes me a bad Kantian, we can imagine someone saying, but I don't see any reason for being a Kantian in the first place. Settling what to do all things considered requires a fundamental decision in the moral realm, just as it does in the gastronomic. Considerations like these in no way show moral realism to be wrong, but they do take some of the bite out of it. If correct, they rob moral realists of one ad hominem argument that often emerges in their debate with the realists. Moral realists often express puzzlement that moral irrealists take their own moral values seriously, given that the irrealists do not believe that these values are or could be objectively correct. An irrealist might be against dishonesty, for example, but why should she take that as providing her with a reason not to be dishonest? The irrealist answer, she just does, seems to the realist to be arbitrary and unprincipled. After all, one could find oneself valuing just anything, such as collecting used matchsticks, sticking one's head in the oven, never lifting one's finger, even if the alternative is the destruction of the entire world. That she happens to value dishonesty instead of these other things does not leave her commitment to it worthy of being taken seriously, any more than a commitment to the more unusual values would underwrite them if she happened to find them appealing. But now it appears that the moral realist has no choice but to take his own values seriously, in just the way that he's puzzled about irrealists taking theirs seriously. He must make a fundamental decision about whether to be governed by the moral values he takes to be correct, or instead to act on what he himself values insofar as it conflicts with that. True, he might value acting in accordance with morality more than he values anything else, but that is an entirely contingent matter in the moral case, just as it was in the gastronomic. Arbitrary or not, in the end we're all in the same boat. In this respect, moral or gastronomic irrealism is no harder to swallow than moral realism.